Hi, welcome back to Wine Country at Work. I'm Ralph Dimitrus, one of the producers with Lonnie Dimitrus, and we're tour guides in Napa, California, though we tour all over the North Bay. And in the process of doing that, we've written 6 editions of tour books over the years. And it's been quite an experience. In the process, we also realized that there were a lot of great stories that take place up in the valleys. So starting back in 2012, we started producing Wine Country at Work. And then we got to 2020, and of course the entire society closed down. But you remember that, right? For like 2 years. And we basically went home. We came out with a new edition of 2 different groups of our books, and we're working on a new book called Wine Country in Shorts, which are the stories we've been telling over our shoulders for years. That's due out whenever we can finish it. But now that we're finally back after 2 years, we're taking a different tack with the show. And we're going to do multiple episodes with multiple segments inside. We'll probably look at wineries that we find interesting due to either their location, their architecture, or their hospitality. We're also going to be looking probably at how well Wine Country is doing on the path to being a healthier, more sustainable place. We're hoping to do a recurring segment on using astrological symbolism to better understand spectacular wines. But today, I'm going to start off this segment with a look at how this 2-year shutdown has changed the region. Now, I have to admit, it changed the world, right? But it changed Wine Country in some really distinctive ways. And I think that the change was bigger on the Napa side than the Sonoma side, but it was pretty dramatic in both ways. When visitors came back to Wine Country, and it wasn't shut that long because wine is a food, so food production never shut down, and the wineries didn't shut down, but there was a period of time when they sent all the people home. In the course of that, one of the things that happened was that the average age of the tasting room staff, in other words, when you walk in the tasting room and who greets you, in Wine Country, especially in Napa and throughout the Sonoma Valley, dropped by about 30 or 40 years. That's pretty dramatic. You see, for years, the wineries had hired, local retirees and have them work part-time in the tasting room, and they filled in, and they filled about 40% of the tasting rooms, and some tasting rooms, they populated it completely. I would talk to a manager up in Russian River recently who had been a manager over at a winery in the north part of the Sonoma Valley, and she said her entire staff came from the over 55 community across the street. That was her whole team. There were a bunch of wineries I could think of up there on B.R. Cohn, where most of the team was older. For instance, our neighbor, Kata, she was working at Chimney Rock after she had retired from being a meeting planner. And she was working with a team of 12 boomers. They were all boomers. They had a great time. They poured wine. They knew all about wine from drinking it their whole life, And then COVID began, and they all got sent home. And later on, when the manager called up and said, "We'd like you to come back now. We're spreading people out. We moved everyone outside. We're going to be wearing masks." Of the 12 boomers, 1 came back. Now, you cannot run a tasting room with 1 person. And so they had to start hiring. They had never paid that well in the tasting rooms. They didn't have to. For the retirees, they had other incomes, and you get to spend the day chatting with people and pouring wine and tasting the wines. It's a very nice job. But now, to get young people to come and apply for these jobs, they had to do what? Offer more money. So the average pay inside the tasting rooms went up substantially. Also, to attract people, they couldn't be offering, part-time job, no benefit. No, I'm not interested. I want full-time, I want better pay, and I want benefits. Okay, because we're not going to be able to run the tasting room without you. So what happened was that this region has a good number of young people, but they wouldn't work in the tasting rooms because they didn't pay well. They wanted to look to the future. Suddenly, the pay's gone up, the benefits have gone up, and it's full time, and it's in an industry that they know all about. Why? Because they spent their time at the kitchen table as a child, chatting with their parents or hearing their parents and their uncles and their aunts and their friends, their family friends talk about the wine industry. If you live in Napa especially, but in Sonoma as well, but especially in Napa, someone you know is working in the wineries, and probably most of the people you know have worked in the wineries at one time or another. It's just the dominant business here. So suddenly, these young people are starting to take over the tasting rooms. I was talking with a manager up up in the Napa Valley, and she said most of her team were young women, all very nice looking, very smart, all locals, primarily locals, all in their 20s. And I said, that's remarkable. Why? He said, because that's who applied. That's who showed up. And it's a small team, it's a tight team, but they're all full time and they're very committed. And they have all types of extra compensation built into this. For one thing, years ago, when you went to the tasting room, you never tipped. Tipping wasn't expected. It's not a bar. They're salespeople. You know, if they sold wine or they sold a wine club, for instance, they made a nice little commission. But now tipping is completely acceptable. In fact, many times when you sign the thing, there's a place for the tip. But also, the wines are so much more expensive. The tasting fees are so much more expensive. They can afford to pay more. Also, when people become members of the wine club, they should ring bells or something when that happens, because the commission that the tasting room staff is making on this is significant. We brought a group of, I guess, 17 to a winery the other day. One person took care of us. And that was interesting. Usually it would be two people, but most of the wineries are a little understaffed. One person took care of us. And for 2 hours, I calculated that the young woman who was pouring from us, who was not from here, she had moved here to be in the industry, in her 20s, had made probably $600 or $700 in commissions and pay from that 2 hours, from my particular people. We had that many people become members of the wine club. That's pretty nice. And that was just 2 hours of an 8-hour shift. That's pretty good. I mean, that was never seen before. You never saw that before when it was all retirees. So you have this whole big shift that has happened. And what happens when you start having young people in the tasting room? Well, first of all, they have to learn, right? It's not like drinking wine is easy. We're okay with that, right? Everyone knows that. Drinking wine is pretty easy. Talking about wine is not. It takes a certain amount of language, but also a certain amount of experience, because you have to experience the wines. The first year of this, 2021, it drove the tour guides crazy, because all these young people were working in the wineries. It was so hard to even make an appointment because people weren't picking up the phone because they were so short-staffed. You'd spend an entire day making appointments for one tour, trying to get people on the phone. People would call you back 3 days later. It was just horrible. I mean, so much so that there's guides who left the business over this. It was just too much work. We stuck to it. We stayed in. We figured let's try another year, see what happens. It got better the next year. But that first year, these young people didn't understand the palates of the boomers who were coming in their door, the people who normally were buying these wines, because they hadn't tasted the wines that much. They hadn't been around them. But after a year of tasting the wines, now it's a different situation. Remember, your body never forgets a flavor and never forgets a scent, ever. And it goes into your library of flavors and your library of scents, and you can become very well read on that subject. And it took them about a year to become very well read and also to get good at handling the systems. This was the cool thing too. The wineries moved over to more and more automated systems, so you could go online and make your appointments. They never had a lot of that before. You called up, you make the appointment. Now you can go online and make the appointments. Well, this young team, they don't remember a time when there weren't computers. They probably don't remember a time when there weren't cell phones. I mean, they're very technological, so they adapted to this very easily. I remember years ago, a concierge who had been in the restaurant business had left being a concierge to go work at one of the wineries on Highway 29. And I was at the winery a while later, and I said, well, how's she doing? Oh, we had to let her go. I said, why? She was a bit older. She could not get what you call the cash register, because it's not a cash, it's a computer. She could not get that to work for her. She couldn't learn how to use it, even though she had come out of restaurants. But it had changed so much over the years from then, when there was actually buttons and cash jumped out of the front and bells went off, to now when you dial and you put the little square thing out and the person put their buttons in and signs it. And though I have to say that if you notice that every single one of these little card things are different, if you've noticed that, I think it's a quiz. I think that if you get it wrong too many times, they're going to come by the house and have a chat with you. I'm just saying. I try to stay up on this stuff. I don't want to have the chat. Lonnie's laughing at me. So what happens when you have a lot of young people in the tasting room? They draw in young customers. First of all, they know people, so their friends come. But also, when young people come to the tasting room, and I'm talking millennials, just not boomers, when they, some of the Xers and some of the Zs, when they show up, right, they're more welcome. If I walk into a winery, I would like someone of my generation pouring for me. Or, for myself personally, I would like either my generation or my children's generation pouring for me, because I like them too. It's like, that's okay with me. But for these young people coming into the tasting room, have some grandfather pouring the wine for you, it's not as entertaining as, a nice, attractive person of your own generation pouring for you. Never underestimate the power of boys and girls, the power of attraction, the power of people of your own generation. They get your references. And that was real interesting. The other thing that's been real interesting, our counties, Napa and Sonoma, are about 40% of them, of the people, are bilingual in English and Spanish. See, what's one of the truths of the North Bay wine country, that it would not exist. We would not be the top destinations. We would not be the top wine producers in the country if it wasn't for our Mexican population, people who've come to Mexico in 1, 2, and 3 generations. The first ones came back in the 70s, and their kids, were born here, and then they went to college here, and now they're winemakers, or they're working in wineries, and now sometimes it's the second, sometimes it's the third generation who's gotten these jobs in the tasting rooms. So who's coming to the tasting rooms now? Their friends. And when people come up who are Latino from the Bay Area, and they can relate to them, they can speak to them in Spanish. I stop people all the time, and I'm always, because we work with a lot of international clients, and I'm always asking people, do you speak another language? Because if you do, and I bring clients there who speak your language, you just made my life much easier. I don't have to spend the time translating. That's nice. I can go sit in the car and edit a tour book. So here people have really great language skills, and so that's really shifted it as well. So now one of the big bugaboos that we've faced in Napa for a long time has been our clientele, our boomers, and they're all getting older and they're retiring and they're not going to buy more wine. How are we going to attract more people? How are we going to attract younger people? Hire younger hosts. That was the whole thing. Hire younger hosts. You didn't have to make people leave, just have a major pandemic. Boom, all fixed, right? But it gets better than that. I think this directly affects the future of wine country generally. Everything in wine country is long term. It takes you a year to prepare the ground to put the vineyard. You put the vineyard in, $100,000 per acre, maybe $70,000 per acre. It's a big commitment. 3 years in, you start getting some grapes. Maybe you pick those grapes and you sell them off cheap because they're not really, they're not really mature yet. They're still really young adolescents. But at 5 years, you start finally getting some grapes. And now you can sell your grapes. 5 years in, actually 6 years in, you're starting to make money from all your work. Long term. If you're a winery, You make the wine, 2 years later you get to sell it. 7 years in, 8 years in, everything is long term, right? So it's strategic. They're great strategic thinkers. So they're always planning, what are we going to plant? What grapes are we going to need in the future? And for years, like in Napa, for instance, over half of the vineyards here are Cabernet Sauvignon. And I'm horrible that I oftentimes say, well, Cabernet Sauvignon is an old man's wine. And the reason I say that is that as people get older, their taste buds get, a little weaker. They're less sensitive. And Cabernet is one of the most flavorful wines. And in truth, young people can like it too, but it's stronger in tannins. Tannins are a sulfur compound, and as people get older, they need more sulfur for their bones and for their skin. So it's a wine that you find really appeals to an older, more experienced palate. A younger person tasting this, it tastes like tart. It tastes harsh to them. They want they want the Pinot Grigio. They want a Pinot Noir, has very low tannins. They want a Malbec. They want a nice Chardonnay, a Vermentino. These very mild, low tannic wines. But as people get older, they like these big wines. They really, and even for young people, you can really develop a taste for them once your body understands what it's doing, what the message is that in that wine. And as these young people are coming, the wineries are going to be selling more and more of other wines besides Cabernet Sauvignon, because that's the big collector's wine. You see, the reason the growers grow so much Cabernet Sauvignon is, one, it's a big money grape. I was up on Deer Park on the way up to Howell Mountain the other day, and the host for my clients was saying, oh, well, we grow here and we sell some of it off to other wineries. We get about $10,000 a ton. $10,000 a ton. That's good money. I remember when it was $5,000. I remember when I was over at the Tocolone Vineyard, and the general manager at Mondavi told me, oh, we're doing great here. We get $7,000 a ton. Across the street, they get $5,000. Now, this is a number of years ago. But it's also that it's on a slope. They get less fruit per acre. It makes higher quality fruit, but the overall price of the fruit has gone up. And the other thing about Cabernet, it's a big producer. It gives you a lot of high quality fruit in a relatively small amount of space. So you get more high quality fruit and you can charge more for it. So what else would you plant? Really, what else would you plant if you can possibly grow good Cab? And there's only certain spots where you can grow good Cab. And there's other places that are good for Merlot, and other places are good for Chardonnay and Pinot or whatever. There's certain spots, there's a certain part off Silverado Trail right by Zinfandel Lane that for years, it's a low spot. For years, it's always been planted to Cabernet Franc. Why? Because it's a really good spot for it. In Cab, it's a little too wet for Cabernet Sauvignon, but great for Cabernet Franc. Location, location, location. So they've really leaned towards this one particular grape, but you have these people who want, these young people who are the new market, who want this other grape, and who better to tell them that than the young hosts who are face to face with them all during the tasting. It's funny, we have good friends who have a winery, and ever since they started it, the mom and the sons, the sons are the winemaker, the mom is the manager, have done every pouring. They've never hired anyone to do the pouring. They have other staff to help with this and that, but they've done every pouring. And as a result, they know what people like. And so it's affected their decisions in terms of what grapes they're going to plant, how they're going to make the wines, what are they going to experiment on, having that up close and personal. I've always said to people that no one really understands wine tourism like tour guides. There's not a lot of us. At the top level, there's maybe, between the two counties, maybe 24 of us. But the reason is, we spend the entire day with the client. They're with the host at the winery for 90 minutes. They're with the people at the hotel for relatively brief periods of time. We're with them for 6 hours, 8 hours, back and forth. But we get to hear at every single winery, how did they like it? How did they like the host? How did they like the environment? How drunk are they? How sober are they? How much do they need food? We're their on the road concierge, but we're also kind of their coach and have to inform them and help them understand the area. So we really get to understand what wine tourism is about. And in terms of, like, people say, well, what's the best wine? It really is whatever you like. And you'd be amazed by the diversity we run into in terms of the kinds of wines people like. It's very, very wide. And up in northern Sonoma, there's a whole bunch of growers who are growing unusual grapes for here. They're growing a lot of the Italian grapes, some of the more unusual French grapes, but a lot of Italian, and Fiano and Vermentino, and I mean, grapes that do well with more heat. And they're really becoming very popular. And we're not seeing that in Napa yet because so much of it's committed to Cabernet Sauvignon. But with this young group of hosts who are going to become what? Managers eventually. They're going to become the next generation of managers. And they're going to be the people who have to tell the owners and the winemakers, this is the way I think we should go. This is the direction I think we should go to. And that's going to be important. I think in many ways that the quarantine, the shutdown, gave Napa back especially, but wine country in generally, a new future, a new lease on life. On to another topic. Right at the end of the 2022 season, we had a heat spike in the Bay Area like no one had ever seen before. It went on for 5 days. Temperatures went up to 118 degrees. This is right during harvest. So, those berries, those grape berries are real big and round and filled with liquid. And of course, what happens when you get a lot of heat? Things shrivel up, things dry out. And know what you get? You get raisins. And we had a large amount of raisining that took place in the vineyards at exactly the wrong time, which is kind of horrible because all through the season, we'd had just beautiful fruit. I mean, just beautiful fruit. It's just gorgeous. Some friends of ours who have, their family has a vineyard. They've owned the land since the 1950s and been growing for many years. They have a lot of experience with it. They were expecting to bring in 180 tons of fruit. Now, remember what I said about $10,000 a ton, maybe $5,000 a ton, something like that, right? 180 tons of fruit. It's a lot of fruit. Some people bring in a lot more around here, but that's still a lot of fruit. They got 130 tons after the raisins. 130 tons. They lost 50 tons of fruit at probably $4,000 to $5,000 a ton because of a 5-day heat wave. That's extreme. That was an extreme event. Now, we've been looking at climate change here in the valleys for a bunch of years. I remember I was at a wine writers conference back in 2008 up at the Culinary Institute of America. They had a presentation at that time. The Vintners Association had paid for a study of how the climate was changing and what they would expect. And back in 2008, these experts were saying, we're going to have to move vineyards. We're going to have to move closer to the coast. We're going to have to move further north. Some people took their advice kind of early. There's actually a major producer, a premium producer, $100, $200 bottles, who produced quite a bit of wine at that point, who has 4 wineries between the 2 counties, and they sold all of their Napa vineyards. They're still buying Napa fruit, but they buy from other people, they lease. But they sold all of their Napa vineyards and bought vineyards up in the Northwest, Oregon, Washington State, where it's much cooler. They really were planning for the future. And this has been an issue, and people have been looking at, should we be planting other grapes? I think it was up at Larkmead, and they were doing experiments with Portuguese grapes. In Portugal, it's much hotter. As I mentioned before, up in northern Sonoma, they're testing a lot of the Italian grapes. These are grapes that deal really well with the heat, the kind of grapes that grow extensively in Campania and in Sicily, very, very warm areas. So they're experimenting with these grapes, but they're really concerned about, are we going to have to massively move vineyards? Well, It's all in the timing, you know? Right as this heat spike was happening, and like days after it, UC Davis announced that they were going to release the results of a study, a 6-year study, 9 researchers, and I think they did the study actually here in Napa, up in Oakville, at their experimental vineyards. They had had 6 different types of trellises. They had also had different kinds of shade cloth, plastic coverings, all different ways to protect the vines from heat. For 6 years, they tested this to see which ones would give them the best results with the best quality. They still had to have good quality. I mean, quality is everything. And what they found was that the main culprit in this whole thing, it was not the sun beating down on the grapes. That's not the problem. It was the ground heating up from the sun and heat coming up and rising, and that's what was causing the raisoning. That's what was causing the damage. The grapes were too close to the ground. See, if you go down into the Central Valley where it's very, very hot, most of the grapes are like 5.5 feet off the ground. And that's where they grow, the big production, wines, the box wines and things like that, but it's high off the ground. And it works really well for them because it's very hot, but also works great with, tractors and other types of automation. We're here up in, wine country, in North Bay, a great deal of this is done by hand. Some picking's done by machine, but a lot of it's done by hand or with tractors, but in a smaller scale. And so why did we plant these plants? Why did generations plant so close to the ground? Because they didn't used to. The reason they planted so close to the ground was that when they moved over to doing the grapes from Europe, from France specifically, Burgundy and Bordeaux, the consultants were all from there. André Cheselchev, he had been trained in France. So what they did was they planted the vines the way they're planted in France, even though France is a lot further north and a lot cooler. So they plant close to the ground to keep them warm. Years ago, the old Italian farmers in Sonoma all planted high. The grapes that came from Chateau Montelena, used in the Judgment of Paris, came from a vineyard where the grapes are easily 5.5 feet off the ground. And those seem to be pretty good. They beat the French. So they came to the conclusion, they did research, and they said that you could transition a vineyard in 18 months to the new, higher configuration. A single wire, the leaves would shade the grapes, and they would shade the grapes better than shade cloth. The things you learn if you just pay attention. So thanks for coming back to Wine Country at Work. We're going to discuss more subjects about the Valley. We're going to also talk with some people around the Valley as we move forward. So happy to be back after the shutdown. Thank you for joining us. And until next time, be well. Cheers.